I'd like to start by explaining that Bloomsbury Ecologies, the short fiction of E.M. Forster and Virginia Woolf, emerged from my desire to study the intersection of two potentially incompatible interests: climate change mitigation strategies today and the modernist literary movements of an earlier century. As such, this senior thesis project relied heavily on the indirect guidance of one environmental humanist and his 2016 publication, The Great Derangement: Climate Change and the Unthinkable. As the author of this book, Amitav Ghosh places literature at the center of the global fight against climate change. In doing so, he defines global warming as a crisis not only of science, but also of culture, and thus of the imagination. Modern fiction, Ghosh argues, has failed to adequately represent the severity of this crisis due to its close associations with two literary traditions: realism and individualism. Of the first of these traditions, he describes the novel's association with probability, explaining that it relocates the unheard of towards the background, while the everyday moves into the foreground. In the context of climate, this means that environmental events lose credibility from a reader's perspective by appearing improbable. More specifically, he defines the current geological age of the Anthropocene as a framework for considering forces of unthinkable magnitude across vast gaps in time and space, before explaining that literary fiction is too deeply grounded in physical settings and time spans to accommodate such forces. On individualism, Ghosh also approaches the role of the non-human in modern fiction. With the birth of this genre, he writes that the literary imagination became radically centered on the human, as opposed to other species, as well as its individual psyche, rather than that of a collective. Each of these trends supports the notion that climate change is incompatible with serious fiction as it stands, meaning this crisis of imagination will only become more severe. The Great Derangement's argument serves as an entirely justified call, in my opinion, for greater spatial, temporal, and subject-related experimentation among future authors of climate fiction. Yet, this English and Environmental Studies senior thesis project emerged from a desire to investigate the ways in which authors of fiction have historically overcome the various challenges that Ghosh associates with writing on the environment, in hopes that literature becomes more well-positioned to inform the ongoing fight against anthropocentric climate change. As such, it argues that we must turn specifically toward the modernist literary movements of the early 20th century, which were marked by resistance to many of the same literary norms and standards that Ghosh expresses a desire to disrupt. Literary modernism has a particular association with urban spaces and aesthetics, and often reflects the technological and industrial advancements of the era, as well as subsequent changes in the relationship between humans and their environments. Ghosh addresses fiction of this period at several points throughout the long history he draws, though it never serves as an exception to the literary trends he identifies. Modernist writing, he explains, was uniformly disdainful of plot and narrative, with an ever greater emphasis laid on style and observation, whether it be of everyday details, traits of character, or nuances of emotion. In other words, he finds it particularly unwelcoming of the improbable, and therefore environmental writing as a whole. Similarly, he describes the genre's individualistic interest in continuous and irreversible forward movement, which rendered works of ecological collectivism irrelevant. In another sense, however, the exact literary freedoms that he identifies while describing modernism might provide some resolution to his self-identified search for ways in which to imagine unthinkable beings and events. This project approaches this complication to Ghosh's argument through the lenses of two specific 20th century writers, E.M. Forster and Virginia Woolf, whose distinctly modern tendencies facilitated the representation of environmental concerns in a work of their short fiction. The stories in question were not chosen only on account of their author's prominence in the Bloomsbury Group, a leading collector of rightists, artists, and intellectuals active in early 20th century London, which I address more fully in my full-length thesis, but also for their wildly different subject interests and rhetorical approaches, which I believe converge in speaking to Ghosh's very specific concerns regarding time, space, species, and collectives in ecological fiction. Together, they exemplify the particular importance of modernist literature in the field of eco-critical studies, and therefore contribute to the discourse surrounding the ability of literature to conform contemporary ecological thought more broadly. E.M. Forster is among the Bloomsbury Group members with the most contested relationships to the modernist movement. In fact, he's been widely categorized as a reluctant modernist, especially in the earlier part of his career, never quite abandoning traditional literary forms in the vein of his contemporaries. Coined by literary scholar David Medley, this term is rooted in a definition of the movement that includes any 20th century writer responding critically to contemporary conditions of modernity. Forster's lifelong work paid strong attention to the pressures facing 20th century British society, and his private writings from these early years reflect his interest in the association between the degradation of a society and its decreasing attachment to nature. As an example, the 1908 news of the first man to fly in a proto-airplane for a minute and a half is said to have inspired his publication of The Machine Stops in the Oxford and Cambridge Review just the following year. The short story, which Forster identifies as his personal mediation in the first lines, features a mother and her son, Kuno, who's outspoken in his rejection of mainstream ideology surrounding the great benefit of modern technology. Called Contrary to the Spirit of the Age in character, he expresses nostalgic anxieties very similar to Forster's, especially regarding the relationship between man and machine at the cost of the natural world. Kuno's character is most starkly separated from Forster himself, to appropriate Gauche's language, through the vast gaps in time and space that exist between the British setting in which the story was written and the imaginary world in which it takes place. Satirizing H.G. Wells' 1905 A Modern Utopia, as well as adopting the general message of parts of Samuel Butler's 1872 Erewhon, Forster creates a dystopian world of underground civilization, occupied by citizens with extreme trust in mechanical systems. They live isolated from one another in private hexagonal cells, but are governed by a machine that serves absolutely all of their individual needs. As a result, they evolve psychologically to value rationality over emotion at almost all costs, and to abandon essentially all care for aesthetics. Though they subscribe to no religion, they worship this technology as such, even praying to a book of the machine. Those who do not adopt this position are subject to homelessness or expulsion from the machine to the surface of the earth, which they have been taught to believe that air quality cannot sustain life. Kuno, however, intrigued by this forbidden place, defies the machine and illegally explores ground level, where he meets the homeless and learns that it is, in fact, habitable. He subsequently questions the stance maintained by his mother, Vashti, and everyone else living under the machine that the apparatus truly serves their best interests. The dystopian nature of this society leads a reader to identify with Kuno and trust the wisdom he gains from his experiences throughout the story. And by the end, Vashti does too. Though this question of polluted air on Earth prompts the central conflict of the narrative, this culture of progress is described as affecting every layer of the ecosystem. The climax of the story occurs when humanity neglects to take Kuno's warning that the machine will eventually stop seriously. As he predicted, its operations slowly begin to decline, light and air quality diminishing, until, as quoted by Forster, the entire communication system broke down all over the world, and the world, as they understood it, ended. In this nightmare from Vashti's worst dreams, her heart is opened, and she knows what had been important on Earth: humankind. It is only with this understanding that Vashti finally develops a true emotional connection with her son. By definition, this story about the fate of an entire fictitious population supports the argument presented by Gauche that a retreat from the literary traditions of realism and individualism is essential to representing the real environmental concerns of the moment in ways that will inspire meaningful action from a reader. Yet, it also sheds light on Gauche's tendency to generalize across genres and literary movements. Despite Forster's commitment to the form of modern fiction, he successfully removes the normative constraints of time and space in this story, thereby centering his narrative of what is essentially climate catastrophe on an imaginary collective. A very different sort of modernist, Virginia Woolf published Kew Gardens 10 years later, just months after the publication of her famous essay, Modern Fiction, in which she outlines her vision of the future of literature in its most innovative and experimental forms. In particular, her idea presented in that essay that life might exist more fully in that which is commonly thought small is especially well represented in this story about the intricacies of a flower bed. Principally, the very short text was meant to constitute an experiment with the removal of both plot and individual character arcs as central literary features. As interior spaces are not present in Kew Gardens, Woolf juxtaposes humans and nature instead through the construction of enclosed outdoor spaces. The first words of the story, from the oval-shaped flower bed, situate its subject in a small, specified ecosystem, which is described by its great flora and fauna. The description then follows a breeze overhead, which is eventually met by the eyes of men and women who walk in Kew Gardens in July. As the story progresses, she quotes, "One couple after another with much the same irregular and aimless movement passes the flower bed, and thus the narrative scope alternates between human and non-human forces. As such, it quickly becomes clear that Woolf's flower bed is not merely a backdrop in a scene of human action, but almost a character in its own right. As shifts in scale from the vantage point of the flower bed establish multiple distinct environments, Woolf creates connections across species lines. Most explicitly, she regularly imposes human features on nature, as well as naturalistic features on humans, describing the flower bed with language of tongues, throats, and flesh, as well as illustrating human movements as, for example, not unlike that of butterflies. Such juxtapositions between human and non-human species, however, are not solely facilitated through metaphor. Ecological connections are cultivated from the first appearance of people in the story, as in each couple that passes the garden, one character experiences a moment of revelation at its site, creating a critical intersection between lives in and around the bed. Furthermore, each concern expressed by a strolling human is paralleled by that of a featured animal. On account of how hot it was, for example, the thrush chooses to hop in the shadow of flowers, just as humans then seek shade beneath the trees. The same comparison can be made for all those species seeking food and drink. These parallels provide a lens through which a reader begins to understand that all species are motivated by the same general factors, and that human concerns differ from plant and animal concerns only by size and self-consciousness. Woolf heightens this sense of multi-species coexistence by particularly highlighting the perspective of a snail, who has a strikingly strong sense of agency and of consciousness. More specifically, the mollusk displays greater awareness of its surrounding and intention in its actions than the surrounding humans do. As figures in the story are described in terms of their pointless gestures and monotonous voices, once they walk past the flower bed, a reader is brought back to the small ecosystem in which the story began. The snail then describes its goals before it patiently considers, deliberates, and decides on its course of action. This language endows a reader to appreciate the scope of what it notices, the effort it takes for him to move, and even details of the maneuvering of its body. By replacing omniscient narration with that of a snail, Woolf separates her work from that which she was known to call the appalling narrative business of the realist. Realism, for Woolf, does not only involve the inclusion of scenes which could truthfully transpire, but also their writing, as if the author is simply, in her words, getting on from lunch to dinner in a linear manner. Neither the snail nor any of the story's other living features placed in this real setting of London's Royal Botanical Gardens are endowed with any unlikely features. As the snail's narration gives a reader access to an otherwise inaccessible perspective, however, Woolf's realism breaks down. The question of animal interiority certainly complicates Gauche's conception of probability in modern fiction. The story's ending, however, is marked by a return to that which is much more familiar. The final paragraph is marked by a change in scope to encompass both the flower bed and the garden as a whole, the new perspective resembling an aerial view over the city. The story then ends with a vision not of nature, but of airplanes, motor omnibuses, and urban noise. This creates an obvious contrast with the flower bed, which comes to be seen as a very small center of natural harmony within a much larger, busier, anthropocentric world. As such, Woolf also manages to avoid endowing her narrative with the sense of humanist humanistic individualism that Gauche associates with linear progression. Indeed, this ending is marked by a universality of voice between each human featured in the story. Under Gauche's framework, it can therefore only be interpreted as a text concerned with larger ecological collectives in which human culture is constantly brought into non-hierarchical conversation with non-human behavior. Placing these stories back in the historical context of the Bloomsbury group, pictured here laying in the grass in this historical photograph taken by Wolf's sister, who you may have noticed also designed the Kew Gardens cover on the last slide and illustrations, we can see that Forster's and Wolf's eco-critical narratives ultimately converge in their rejections of the literary pastoral, a genre that tended to idealize and simplify the role nature plays in human lives. They have, in literary criticism, both been associated with the post-pastoral, as used by eco-critical scholar Terry Guilford to describe works that successfully suggest a collapse of the human-nature divide while being aware of the problematics involved. Most importantly, they represent the natural world existing in literature for its own sake, rather than to merely reflect, say, a character's internal emotions. As another framework for considering these works in conversation with one another, while Forster identifies a clear societal issue, Wolf presents somewhat of a solution in expressing the importance of human cohesion with nature in an era of great urbanization and industrialization. This is not to say that both stories cannot also be read as metaphors for larger humanistic issues. Most notably, critics have found every reason to interpret The Machine Stops as reflective of the dangers of a totalitarian state, as well as Kew Gardens as a feminist text, in which women connect with nature in particularly constructive ways. Under Gauche's framework of intersectional environmentalism, metaphorical interpretations of these stories do not necessarily detract from their ecological messaging. Rather, they might promote thinking on nature's association with human sociality of all sorts. Throughout The Great Derangement, Gauche promotes writing that places conversations about atmospheric carbon, as he quotes, within the same context as debates about inequality, poverty, and social justice. Though modernist fiction, of course, predates vocabulary of both climate change and environmental equity, these works have proved themselves to meet the requirements set forth by Gauche to be put in conversation with climate studies. More explicitly, their unconventional treatment of time and space and of multi-species collectives in approaching a range of environmental subjects qualify them to inform the future of literature that does explicitly center itself on anthropocentric climate change. Despite Gauche's assurance that modernist fiction is unfit to do so, these Bloomsbury Group works certainly exemplify the power of literature to alleviate an ever-growing ecological crisis of the imagination in the 21st century. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'd like to give thanks first to the Wolf Humanities Center for also supporting my project, and also to my research advisor, who I believe should be on Zoom, Dr. Catherine Hellerstein, who's been an indispensable resource and guiding light so far. Ihr seid die Inspiratia, you are my inspiration. In my paper, I discuss how literary and artistic works by Jewish cultural creators at this dire time in Europe, especially Eastern Europe, flex and modulate across the planes of poetics and Yidishkeyt, defined as Yiddishness or Jewishness. As a proponent of Yiddish language, literature, art, and culture, a Yiddishist as we call ourselves, my project more broadly concerns the legacy of Yiddish writers and artists. My research probes the questions, has there ever existed a quote-unquote Yiddish national tone, which I define as a collective spirit of Yiddish shared across its communities and creation? Could this tone ever have existed? And as Eastern European Jewish life was catapulted again into jeopardy, what did it mean for a cultural work to be Jewish or Yiddish, perhaps before it was ever European? With all of this in mind, what's the importance of Yidishkeyt to these cultural creators, and why does it matter to the avant-garde or even to us today? To Yiddishists now, modern Yiddish literature began with the advent of three 19th century European Yiddish writers known as the Fathers. Born to the stringent Pale of Settlement, which was the region of the Russian Empire that restricted Jewish movement between the late 18th and early 20th century, they were Mendele Moichers Forum, Shalom Aleichem, and Yud Lamed Peretz. When these powerhouses died during World War I, the consequence of Jewish cultural creation in Europe then fell upon Yiddish artistic and literary collectives. These members were based out of the budding Jewish cultural hubs of the Russian Empire in Central Europe, particularly Warsaw, Lodz, and Berlin. In this paper, I will discuss such collectives and their cultural ideas, relating more broadly to the Yiddish modernist and avant-garde collective and movement of Die Chaliastra, which existed from 1919 to 1924. The journals that such collectives created, varying in expressionist and modernist styles, include Jung Yiddish from 1918 to 1921, Ringen from 1921 to 1922, and Albatross from 1922 to 1923, just to name a few. For the purposes of this condensed discussion, I will only reference Jung Yiddish and Albatross. I'll use these journals, their artistry, and their members' ideologies to frame my research around this Yiddish national tone and the beliefs around Yidishkeyt of the period, which can only occur in these literary and artistic works. A knowledge of my discussion requires that you know the history of Yiddish as a national language. In brief, it's commonly regarded that Yiddish began to develop as Jews found themselves in Germany's Rhine Valley in the 9th and 10th centuries. A more defining feature of the language, its culture, and its people is that Yiddish has existed since without any connection to a home country, unlike other languages with national association, for example, French in France or Polish in Poland, and I'll leave you to the rest. The history of this malleability is important to conceptualize. Eastern European Jewish people transposed to other European centers among the censorship of Yiddish cultural works by national forces such as the Russian Empire and Poland. What then is this Yiddish national tone in lieu of a historical Yiddish nation? Since the beginning of the urbanizing 20th century, European Jews found themselves generating Jewish cultural works in cities, with primary ones being Warsaw and Vilna, now known as Vilnius in Lithuania. At this point, the primary concern of Yiddish culture creation were the secular modes of Soviet Yiddish, like futurism and symbolism, versus more Central European modes like expressionism. In response to anti-Jewish sentiments and Jewish states of fear, especially after World War I, and into the systemic political massacres of Jews during the ensuing Polish-Soviet and Russian civil wars, the Yiddish avant-garde began to develop as modernism took hold on the majority of Europe in the early 20th century. The most considerable themes of the Yiddish avant-garde were born out of some stubborn grasp of on melancholia, alienation, despair, and the apocalypse. This was marked especially in response to the Jewish shtetl, the traditional Eastern European Jewish village, and its thematic imagery of death and ritual, including its slow erasure from the secularizing and dwindling Jewish existence. While not tending immediately to traditional or biblical concerns of Judaism, the most considerable attentions of the avant-garde were on producing a full-force secular spirit of Yiddish culture in Eastern Europe. This secular spirit contributed to the longevity of Yiddishkeyt for the sake of producing it either as an act of rebellion or some new elevated sense of artistry. Some cultural creators and literary agents, such as Moshe Broderson and his Young Yiddish collective in 1918, brought Moscovian symbolism and futurism to the Yiddish avant-garde. These movements then affixed to Young Yiddish's already founded expressionism. With a fondness, too, for Yiddish folklore, such was the height of its continuation of traditional Yiddish culture. After the three fathers of modern Yiddish literature died, it was the belief of Young Yiddish itself that it was, quote-unquote, an heir to Peretz, one of the founders of modern Yiddish literature. The group believed that his criticality, yet emphasis on traditional forms of Jewish life, endured the fullness of Yiddishkeyt. Young Yiddish, which again existed from 1918 to 1921, was formed by Broderson out of Lodz with other prominent Yiddish writers and artists. It was the first of these avant-garde Yiddish publications to partner European modes of thinking, especially of Moscow, to the search for a Yiddish national tone. Additionally, Young Yiddish's subtitle, Lieder und Wort, in Wort und Zeichnung, translated to Poems in Words and Drawings, embraced a collaborative poetic timbre. This poetics allowed the Yiddish avant-garde a comfort to pair the written word with the image. This poetic ideology contributed to the German modernist idea of Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art, with a centralization of all artistic forces to achieve the total artwork. In Young Yiddish's poetic exploration, rooted also in the openness of expressionism, which persisted into Albatross, I argue that Yidishkeyt had never been more prominent and nurtured. If anything, the works of Young Yiddish function not only as intellectual responses to the catastrophes of Eastern Europe, it also served as a glimpse into the modernist endeavor to preserve Yiddishkeyt and its aesthetics, particularly its relationship to folklore and tradition. In the first issue of Young Yiddish, published in 1919, the group outlines its manifesto. For art, the young beautiful Yiddish, and for the eternal speech of the prophets, without beauty, the world cannot be possible. As a steward of a Yiddish that is young and beautiful, Broderzon and his counterparts express an enduring focus on the importance of Yiddishkeyt to the cultural fabric of its existence. At the same time, the phrase, and for the eternal speech of the prophets, demonstrates Young Yiddish's trust in the validity of Jewish traditional texts, such as the Hebrew Bible. In constructing a Yiddish national tone, Young Yiddish acknowledges and repurposes Jewish narratives with alignments to expressionism and futurism. This construction of a Yiddish national tone is made in order to express the newfound creative and moral depths of these movements and their instruction for the avant-garde. For example, Broderzon himself writes a poem in the first issue of Young Yiddish titled Ich a Purim Spieler, translating to I a Purim player. Broderzon's poem is about Purim, the secular and lavish Jewish holiday, celebrating the Persian Queen Esther's resistance against the anti-Semitic Haman. Broderzon's poem serves as example of Young Yiddish's poetics and this modernist Jewish contention with traditional stories, folklore, and culture. The narrative of Broderzon's poem comments on the Purim Spiel, a traditional Ashkenazi Jewish stage performance dedicated to the story of Queen Esther. As part of the spiel, there are Purim Spielers, dressed in costume and usually masked, who recite monologues and skits based off the original biblical text known as the Megillah. However, Broderzon distorts the traditional joviality of the holiday time and comments satirically on the catastrophes surrounding Jewish life. As his Purim player dances across the scene, his narrator gestures that the chaos of this post-World War world doesn't matter as long as Purim is here. He writes, "And somewhere the hardship and hunger are governed, and somewhere a storm of suffering wreaks havoc. Oi, today is Purim, and today I'm a young Jew, and tears smile across my lonesome eyes, and I speak so modern and veiled, and inflecting courteously to this rabble hidden behind the mask from the light, my pale and tortured young face of gazes unsacred and unseen." Broderzon's satirical subversion of Purim's significance is intentional. He plots his Purim player in no man's land, forcing him to dawdle between all that's occurring in the world. In line with the manifestos of Young Yiddish, perhaps this dawdling extends to the group's lack of subscribing to any one modernist art movement. Broderzon, who manipulates his Purim player like that of a marionette, communicates a different language that is not only foundational to the avant-garde in its belief of the autonomy of art as reality. Conversely, as scholar Catherine Hellerstein writes, for Broderzon's Purim player, all the competing ideologies of the day, traditional Judaism, socialism, and Zionism, are poison. The Jewish artist, Broderzon intimates, must attempt to carve out a space outside the ideological force field. While of course taking inspiration from all of Europe's literary and artistic mediums, this space in Broderzon's work and his Young Yiddish avant-gardists becomes the spirit of Yidishkeyt and Yiddish expressionism, fully and on its own. Sadly, for sake of time, I can only say that the expressionist lino cuts throughout, depicting traditional Jewish scenes and contorting the structure of bodies, reflect this idea of manipulating Jewish tradition. I'll leave you to see these images on the screen, which provoke this sense of Yiddish expressionism, of tact and seriousness, of the fluidity of the Jewish form. Uri Tzvi Greenberg, who lived from 1896 to 1981, created the Albatross Journal in 1922 in Warsaw. Although created in response to the dissolution of Young Yiddish, Albatross maintained its unity to Young Yiddish's belief of Yiddish expressionism and its purpose for the avant-garde's conception of Yiddishkeyt. The only point of difference, as scholar Seth Wolitz claims, was the Jews' growing relationship to Zionism, a new rejection of the Jewish folkloristic past, and the departure from the stringent communities of Poland and Russia. Most importantly, Albatross began to publish in Berlin in 1923, starting with its third issue, proving that Eastern Europe was too anti-Semitic and censoring, for Greenberg's tastes, given the rapidity of pogromen, defined as the state-organized murder of Jewish communities at the time. In the second issue of Albatross, literary critic Max Erich, who lived from 1898 to 1937, writes an essay titled Die Sprache von dem Jiddischen Expressionism, translated to The Language of Yiddish Expressionism. With it, Erich interprets the placement of Yiddish Expressionism as something new and formative to Yiddish cultural creation. In The Search for Yidishkeyt, Erich writes about the form and meaning of this new movement. The current stadium of Yiddish Expressionism is still linguistically of Romanticism. That is, its strength becomes measured according to the events at hand. These events are placed directly at the poet, who's still a lot stronger than the facilities of his creation. And this language of our youth is the language of the proletariat, which suffocates underneath a heavy weight. For this reason, the language is very hoarse, convulsive, each word screaming out like from some brutish captivity, yet so content with this now that it's free. Erich's belief of Yiddish Expressionism as a force for the Jewish proletariat, the working people, differs this movement from others before it. Tied to the plight of the Jewish people and their catastrophes, Erich notes that the Hebraic traditional language implanted in Yiddish is expressionistic and outspoken in quality. Erich clarifies, circularity, musicality, everything dominant, melodicity are not expressionist attributes. This endurance of language as resistance configures Albatross in a more visibly Yiddishist way. As Greenberg's radical and unharmonious work will show, the intensity of his Yiddish cultural creation becomes rich in its unmusical, unmelodic fight for Yidishkeyt, a crude poetics previously unseen to Yiddish. For example, Greenberg's poem in the second issue of Albatross, Urit Zvi Flarten Salem, translated to Urit Zvi Before the Cross, is a full-blown force of Yiddish Expressionism. The typographic layout of the poem, confined to the shape of Jesus' crucifix, comments on the rigidity of Christian Europe against Judaism. Additionally, this text wrapping reflects the avant-garde idea of typography as an art medium of its own. Like in Jung Yiddish, an element of Gesamtkunstwerk is preserved. In Greenberg's poem, his narrator positions himself against Jesus, commenting, like Brotherson, on catastrophes against the Eastern European Jews. Greenberg writes with anger, I writhe, brother Yeshu, a skin and bone Jew 2,000 years after you so old, rise, and my lips are torn apart, red wound in the void. Flashing snake-like, woe, my voice thunders from my blood. He continues, Brother Yeshu, 2,000 years you've had your peace and quiet on the cross. Around you the world is ending. Ach, don't you remember a thing? In positioning his narrator against Jesus, Greenberg thwarts the Christian narrative that the Jews killed Jesus, in such a way suggesting that perhaps Jesus killed the Jews, metaphorically speaking. Greenberg uses his poem as an unkind and irregular manifestation of Yiddishkeyt, confirming Erich's belief that Greenberg and his contemporaries were contributors to Yiddish Expressionism's hoarse language and form. That is, as scholar Daria Vakrushova posits, Greenberg and his others demanded an art that would give voice to the sufferings of modern man, expressing both the proclamation and the protest through references to discarded ideals and contemporary rivals. Greenberg proves here that he's transcended past the need for Jewish folklore or the Jewish past to make his points. Instead, he has now modified the Jewish narrative with a Yiddish expressionist thirst for religious confrontation and therefore a protection to Yiddishkeyt. To branch out and conform, the remaining Yiddish writers and artists of Eastern Europe fled to more intellectually appealing centers such as Paris and Berlin, starting as early as 1919. Cultural assimilation became felt as some kind of necessity, with all remnants of Yiddish Expressionism merely diffusing in the multiculturalism of these new secular cities in 1924 with the end of the larger Die Chaliastra movement. As scholar Barbara Mann puts it, ironically, what was perceived as Judaism's handicap in relation to artistic forms, its resistance to figuration, precipitated an evolution away from it. Despite this diffusion, I interpret the shifting away from the Yiddish avant-garde as still a celebration of Yiddishkeyt's endurance. Yiddish expressionist writers and artists in the worlds of Brotherson and Greenberg created and evolved a universal sensitivity to ideas like tradition and catastrophe. Diffused or not in the now international arena of modernism, these Yiddish cultural creators preserved their Yiddishkeyt through anti-Semitism, through war, through murder, all with an exacting emotion, poetics, and criticality. Confronting and rejecting the other artistic forms of the time, these Jewish cultural creators conformed and yet revolted to the extent of European expressionism with their own Yiddish expressionism. Perhaps it's not the original purpose of the Yiddish avant-garde in the permanent search of the new, but the powerful intellectualism of Yiddish expressionism, always as response to its own creation and the threats beyond it, proliferates the very Yiddishkeyt ideal that contemporary Yiddishists have come to value, the permanent search of the Jew in flux, the flux in Yiddish that has endured today. Thank you.
Yeah, we're happy to take questions from the audience for our panelists. I have a million things I want to talk to them about, but I want to open it up to others too.
I have a question. Well, first of all, congratulations to all of you. I agree they were wonderfully rich and subtle presentations, so thank you. Question for Zoe. I'm wondering if your larger project focuses on British modernist fiction, and wondering why you might have chosen that nationality to focus on for your project, just because there are such strong traditions of respect for nature in Germany, in the United States, other places that, I don't know, they just seem to me like they might be more obvious choices. But not that, so, I mean, I think you've done a great job, but I'm just wondering about the way you're drawing boundaries around your project.
Thank you. Yes, there absolutely are traditions of kind of environmental writing and writing that comments on environment in different ways from around the world at this time, in a moment of such vast changes in landscapes in so many different places. To be completely honest, I got to this idea because I just developed a real fascination with Woolf. As kind of a leader in the Bloomsbury group, but also in kind of the innovative ways that she wrote very separately from all of them. And some scholarship has been done in the past, decade, especially around like eco-Wolf studies, eco-criticism in Wolf studies that explores throughout many of her works. Kew Gardens is just one I decided to focus on, but her treatment of animals, of lands, of, different domesticated landscapes, botanical landscapes, and also wilderness. And so I started with Wolf as a point from which to begin. And then as I was learning about the Bloomsbury group as a whole, I realized that Forster, and especially this story, comments on environment in such a vastly different way, focusing on a very different landscape and using very different rhetorical strategies to do so, that I thought I might as well broaden my focus up onto this group rather than just one writer, in order to show that there was an interest in very different environments in this moment, and to show that they contribute to our contemporary discourse around climate change in very different ways. So that's how I got there, but if I were to continue research on this project, I would absolutely consider a more global scope.
I think that this was actually something that all of your papers shared too, this kind of ability to come at an issue a little bit askance, right? Like this, and this relates to the idea of recovery and recuperation, right? So in your paper, you're recovering Josephine Walters, this artist who we otherwise wouldn't have known about except for the networks, exploring the networks of what she's working on, right? And same with the idea of kind of Yidishkeyt and the Yiddish avant-garde, right? And the application of kind of Yiddishness to a movement that's better known through European non-Jewish authors and writers, right? So I wonder if all of you might respond to that question of like coming at something from a different angle. What does that do for your work? How did you approach this? How did you come at these questions to begin with?
I can start. 'Cause I come at my work from a very different way than art history is. I grew up doing genealogy with my mother, so it's a set of research techniques that are not incorporated in art history traditionally. There are obviously professional genealogists who historians often consult for this kind of work, but I feel that doing the work myself allows me to come up with research questions that I feel comfortable answering, or I feel like I can somehow get at them. Whereas if I was just coming from an art historical standpoint, I don't know if I would ever think to ask the question about Josephine's family medical history, because I wouldn't know at all how to get at that kind of information or how to trace that.
I guess the most prominent example, I think, obviously, was the poem by Urwitz v. Greenberg, In the Shape of Jesus Crucifix. I think I'm inclined to look at things similarly in a design discipline, with an attention to, how things are laid out on the page. I think that can be very easily overlooked by, scholars of literature. And I think, it's obviously not too obvious. I mean, you look at the liner cuts and woodcuts that are in these journals as well, and I think, people are more inclined to look at those as well with literature, but I think there's an aspect to be had with more discrete elements of design. And I think that's one thing that I wanted to really piece together. I mean, obviously, the shape of it is very obvious with, INRI displayed above it. Anyone can look at it without knowing the language and understand that it is about Jesus and it's about his narrative. But I think looking at it, it's not too confrontational until you actually read it. And I think, probing these different questions really prompted me to think of, how these writers are sort of, and these designers are really evoking the sense of retaliation and confrontation. And I think that might not be something that's really explicit otherwise. So I think looking deeper at these different things that not everyone is taking a look at, I think really it gives me greater appreciation for what I'm researching, but also too, I think it's another level, a level of depth that people are still uncovering with me. So it's like collaborative, I would say, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's forcing you to go back to the materials, right? You have to look at the layout of the text on the page. You have to look at the image in relation to the text, in the same way that Eiley is being forced to go back to, looking at property records, it sounds like, right? Like things that an art historian wouldn't typically look at necessarily, that you're doing more biographical work, like looking at materials in their original form. And Zoe, I loved, of course, that you put the book covers up to see the kind of texture of even how the authors are kind of presenting their own work.
It's so interesting to hear about everyone's very personal connections to what they're studying. I think that, for me, I am someone that thinks about and worries about climate change a lot, just aside from this project. And I think a lot about the reasons that despite all the information we have about the current state of our planet, what is holding us back as a society from acting in a lot of the ways that we know we should to mitigate climate change. And I think a lot about the ways that we can be more convinced that these changes that are happening are truly happening and take action. And I think literature and art are really amazing in this way because they let us imagine futures and possibilities that are really hard for us to imagine or in ourselves, and literature kind of spells them out for us. So I approach these works from this angle because I wanted to see kind of what these disciplines we don't necessarily turn to in thinking about climate change most predominantly can offer. And then in ending up focusing on the works that I did, it was really, as I said many times, that Gauche book that talks about the intersection of environmentalism and different eras of writing, and the kind of what it lays out as requirements for writing about climate. I thought that these Bloomsbury Group works really did just that.
Yeah, great. Other questions from the audience for any of our panelists? We have a microphone in the back, ready and waiting for you. Go for it. I don't want it to just be me.
Well, I'll ask Eiley a question that actually follows on the question about loss from the beginning. I was wondering if there's a connection between Walter's loss, the kind of tragedy she suffered in her life, and your sense of the loss of her career. Because I remember back at the beginning of your project, you were so struck by the fact that her parents were first cousins, and there was this underlying medical situation. There was some kind of resonance of that tragedy, I think, that you were responding to I'm just wondering if you see a connection between those two senses of loss in your project.
I definitely do. I think that the loss that she goes through and the grief she goes through having to withdraw from her career and, in a sense, lose her career to take care of herself and her family is so connected to her story, and also why historically she's not remembered is because during the 1880s there was a dramatic increase in the number of women artists working in New York City. And so the amount of recorded like biographies and newspaper articles and that and who gets into an archive is for women artists is kind of pushed 1880 forward. So for the women who are operating earlier and didn't get to live through the 1880s, were lost. And that's what I see with Josephine, is this really tragic sense of she suffering from cancer and withdrawals from her career just at the moment where it creates this loss. I have this feeling like if she lived 5 more years, maybe she would have had like a biography. Somebody would have written more about her because there was a concerted effort in the 1880s to record women artists more. But it's just a consequence of timing and history. So that's why I think it's important to kind of create this timeline and figure out why these sorts of things may have happened. I'm also very careful. I don't want to say for sure because I don't have her letters. I don't have her voice. Generally, so a lot of it is perhapses, but trying to look at the accumulation of evidence to see where that points to and what that suggests.
Where are her paintings now, largely, and what types of collections?
A lot of them are in the Northeast. So ones that I showed today, there's one in Birmingham, Alabama, which is the outlier. The rest are pretty much in the Northeast. There's one at the New York Historical Society. There are a lot in private well, there's a couple in private collections, not a lot. Also at the Hyde Collection in New York. So they stayed really close, mostly in New York. And so that's an interesting question going forward, is figuring out how her paintings got dispersed, especially considering, like, did her family disperse them in some way? Is it the people who bought them once she was alive? What happens to them? And there's also the question of, do people even know if they have her paintings? Because she often signed just with her initials, which is something a lot of women did. And so if there's a painting with an MJW at that bottom, and you don't know who Mary Josephine Walters is, then you don't know. And so that's one of the things I actually ran into at when I was at the New Bedford Whaling Museum in Massachusetts looking at Robert Swing-Gifford's archives, is that I found a sketch done by her in one of his wife's scrapbooks, but it wasn't cataloged because it just was signed MJW, and there was a little note about this was done by Miss Walters, but otherwise you wouldn't know who that was.
Do you think that MJW is a function of the type of audience she's reaching with her paintings, or is it more of a function of a kind of feminine sensibility that declines towards capital A authorship, or a combination of these things? I mean, I think about this a lot with women authors in general, and how they're always negotiating a pretty fraught playing field and a fraught area of reception for their work, right? So are the initials like part of that negotiation, or something more mundane, do you think?
That's a really interesting question, and I've thought about this a lot because when she was alive, she had to be seen as a woman. She was not working in publishing or in any sense where she could disguise her gender, because to sell her paintings, people had to know who she was. And so much of her career and artists at the time in New York City have to do with negotiating with the press, or like talking with clients, having them come to your studio or interview you. So in newspaper articles, she's always Miss. So everybody knows that she was a woman. With the paintings, she does do initials for her first name. Sometimes she says Walters, but I don't know if that's something a lot of artists did, is they do the initials. So I don't know. There are different things pointing to different answers, I guess.
Other questions from the audience? Yes.
So I've been silent and not asking questions because I have asked so many questions during our workshopping sections. So I almost feel that wouldn't be fair for me. But one question that I have for all three of you, I've been thinking about, how to bring all your papers together. What would I do as a discussant? And instead of offering my own judgment, I'm going to ask you about what strikes me is that all of you, if not during your presentations here, but at least in the versions of papers that I previously saw, and obviously, Eily, this is right in your paper here, but for Zoe, I remember discussing some archival material, some letters in which the garden was mentioned and how that brought into, which didn't make it into your presentation, and also for Tyler. So the question is that all three of you are dealing with archival documents, and you're searching for some evidence in order to reconstruct the lost picture. So there is this nostalgia for reconstruction of the lost information. It's kind of detective work. So I was wondering if you can reflect on what it means to you. And Eily has already said that, but maybe you can reiterate, but also to Zoe and Tyler, what were the moments that really spoke to you when you realized that, this evidence, maybe it's a lot of perhaps, but how I can use this evidence and what does it say? So what was the value of just working with the objects and use this archival information in order to reconstruct the way you thought about your topics?
Yeah, I can speak about the letter that I think you're referring to, which did not make it into my presentation, but I learned that Catherine Mansfield, who was another prominent women writer at this time, who was kind of on the edge of the Bloomsbury group, maybe not considered really part of the group, but had a lot of connections with people in it, and had a close friendship and association with Woolf. They had some correspondence about the story Kew Gardens. And I learned that Mansfield wrote a letter to Woolf right before it was published saying, I have this great idea for this story, and it would involve, people walking past the flower bed, but once they passed, it would go, it wouldn't follow the people, it would stay in this setting. And she said something along the lines of what I said about the flower bed being almost a character in its own right rather than a backdrop like we might expect from a story about a garden. And at first I was like, did Woolf steal this idea from Mansfield? This is such an unexpected turn because they had such a friendship. But then it turns out there are more letters in which Mansfield wrote, I love what you've done with the story, Woolf. So it was obviously somewhat of a collaboration between the two. And this was a really exciting moment for me because in putting Wolf and Forster even in conversation, I'm thinking about the relationships and the politics of this group, and the ways that they work together in crafting these different ecological philosophies that I think they had. And then with Forster, I mentioned just now that I learned from his diary entries. One of the great things about studying these writers is that they have all these published diaries. So you can learn a lot about what they were thinking as they were writing these different pieces. And I learned that Forster credits being inspired with this news about the first airplane in the air for a minute and a half in France. And that just solidified the idea I already had that he was kind of thinking about these technological changes and what they were doing to society and how we could reflect on them through, not himself, but through the character of Kuno. And it kind of solidified this idea I already had that a lot of his ethos was put into this main character. So those archival moments were very exciting to me because they definitely furthered my ideas about both authors.
I mean, I guess when it comes for me, working a different language, especially finding resources, especially primary sources, is very, very difficult. I had to bend over backward to get a copy of Albatross from a rare bookstore. I don't know, there's a personal quality to it. I mean, Yiddish to me is obviously not my first language, but to me it almost feels like one ancestrally. I'm uncovering a personal history that I think is transferable to what I'm researching. Researching what I'm interested in, avant-garde, Yiddish literature and art to me, blends my interests, I would say my modern interests with obviously, interests that I think precede mine. I think there's a catering to the past that I really enjoy, trying to find, there's an inescapable nature of the unknown, and I think from all of us, we're trying to, I guess, inflect across this unknown. How do we manipulate the unknown? How do we make it known? And do we have to make it known? I think so. I think it's a responsibility for all of us to make things that are previously unknown or unheard known and heard. And I think that's one thing that I'm trying to obviously address as well. But the resources were really hard to get to. Also, you can easily bypass something without looking at it close up. I talked about that with the typography, but that's obviously more, you can look at it, you can understand what the message is saying, but I think explicitly, because, I don't read Yiddish the way I do English, so it's different. I very easily could have passed by the language of Yiddish expressionism, that essay, if I had not stuck down to the page and investigated what this actually was saying. And I think that piece is so instrumental to the entire movement. Without it, I don't think I could have had my discussion today, really. I think it's really instrumental. And so I think, things like that are just so personal and so investigative. And I think it's a really big part of literature and art, I think, especially with our investigative minds putting it together. But yeah, it's a joy, really, to grapple with existence and grapple with others' existences too. So.
I think we had another. Oh, would you like to
No,
respond?
I already answered plenty of that. I don't need to. It's okay.
We have some questions from online listeners.
We have a question in the room here, and then maybe we can move to the Zoom.
I don't know how to use a mic like this. I might just yell. Okay. So I was thinking about your projects and sort of trying to find synthesis, and one grand kind of theme that came out for me is that all three of you're students of art in different mediums and students of art in the past, but also I imagine in our present moment. And with these projects you have, and I don't mean to put words in anybody's mouth, so forgive me if I describe it wrong, but you are describing or studying expression that has been in some way stifled or forgotten, be it in the process of recording an artist's mark on the New York City art world, or the presence of ecological themes in fiction, or expression of Yidishkeyt and beautiful art in the face of great Jewish suffering. And with this in mind, will burden you with the question that was placed on the previous panel of, as you study stifled or forgotten expression in art, what is to be done, and I imagine you all have different answers to this question, but for you personally in your research, is the project to, as Tyler just said, continue the process of uncovering and revealing things that are there, that exist already, but have not been done justice? Or is the project to inspire artistic creation in the present moment that is speaking on climate change and literature and supporting women artists and supporting Jewish artists? So where would you, if you were to continue this work, would you keep looking to the past, or is there any place for it in present production?
I would love to start. In my field, there are no more than, I would say, 300 Yiddish scholars on Earth. It's very small, it's very niche, and also put out a statistic, only 2% of Yiddish works have been translated into English. So there's a whole wealth of literature to be discovered. Many artists and writers are not known. There's a very famous anthology in the field of Yiddish studies called Yidishkeyt, which translates to female Jewish writers, and it was published by Ezra Corman in 1928 in Chicago, I believe, and it just has names and some works of these female Yiddish poets, and many of them have not been translated. Many of them have not been researched. Their names exist in placards and archives, but none of them have really been ventured and explored into. So I mean, I think, especially for Yiddish, it's really important to delve into the past, because without it, we can't see the present or the future. I'm sure that differs across other disciplines, but I think, Yiddish has come to the discipline in such a way that is so much about uncovering. It's not about the self. It's a very selfless act of treating the humanities, I think. It's very personal. It's about history, and I think it's only about history. That's very radical to say, but I mean, I think it really is. It's very much personal. And I don't know, I mean, part of it's about thwarting the narratives that have been pushed onto it. I mean, there are many misconceptions, like Yiddish is a dialect of German. It's not. I don't know, Yiddish is dying. It's not. It's reading really well. I mean, sure, it kind of scares people to know that, okay, there are not many people doing this secularly. You obviously have Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn who speak Yiddish day to day, but people who learn it like me, who, just drop into college and want to learn it, there's not many people like that. So I think it's really hard because to attract scholarship and new scholarship especially, you can't force that on anyone. And I think people just have to come and understand that, it's here. I mean, also, too, I think there's a really strange emphasis on Holocaust literature in Yiddish, because so much of it was composed. And I think when thinking of the field, I think there has to be a decentralization on the Holocaust. Dare I say the H word, the thing that should not be named. But I mean, it's just such a big catastrophe. It's the biggest, obviously, most well-known catastrophe of the European, Jewish people. So there's so much to be done. I think, the stereotypes, the things that people want to believe, they need to be changed. And I think, not many people know about that explicitly. So it's kind of the work of us to be the advocators and the caretakers of a language that we're learning out of service for the people that came before us.
That is such an inspiring answer. I would say that I have a very different one for my project, because the writers I'm working on, admittedly, have been written about a lot. There's a lot of scholarship around them. I've taken entire classes at Penn just on Woolf, so there's no shortage of that in itself, maybe more with the intersection that I'm putting on these works there is. To answer your question, it's about the past and it's about the future, because I've now taken classes at Penn where we've had ego-critical approaches to ancient literature and medieval literature, and there's so much to be learned about the present from that. But the goal of this entire project was to think about how literature can be a means of dealing with climate change today. So I really am looking towards not just the future, but the present, thinking about how it's already affecting us. And I hope to see both these themes in more contemporary literature, but also I hope to see these themes negotiated in very different, very new and experimental ways. There's environmental literature, which is a growing field, especially climate fiction is very prevalent right now. There's been a lot of bestsellers recently that are climate fiction, and that's its own genre, but I also just want to see themes of environmental struggle and grief and crisis in literature about everything else, so that we can see how climate change intersects with our daily lives in so many different ways, and it will do so increasingly. So, yeah.
To answer your question about the past or the present with my project, I'm lucky to be able to do this project at this point in time because of the digitization of all of these historical records. Most of what I do is online work, going through archives, digital archives, which still takes a lot of time, but is way less time than would have been 10, 20 years ago. And so this project may have taken decades to do before, but now with the advent of the internet, you can do this much more quickly, and be able to diagram these kind of things much more easily. And every day there are like thousands of records being put online, being digitized. Like New York City, for example, is putting all of their historic vitals records, like birth, death, marriage documents online. And I kid you not, every 2 weeks I have to go back and check, because sometimes I find new stuff that's currently being put on there that gives a fuller view of the past. And so in the present, because of the advent of the internet, we have the ability to access the past in a way that we couldn't before. And so there's so much work to do in the present about the past that was not possible until recently.
Do we have time for one question maybe from Zoom?
Okay, this is from Professor Catherine Hellerstein for Tyler. You did touch on this a little bit, but I did want to at least announce this. First, she says, thank you to all three panelists for excellent, fascinating papers. Tyler, where does one find these avant-garde Yiddish journals today, and how hard is it to see them in the flesh?
She's been there with me for the ride as I kind of uncover this. I'm doing an independent study with Dr. Hellerstein. You have to, Google doesn't do enough. You just have to, I feel like, okay, I have to speak metaphorically, but it's not going to make any sense. You have to like kind of elevate yourself to like a higher sense of understanding, and that means nothing really. But I mean, what I mean is, I don't know. You have to have the gall to like really dive into it. Like you have to have the motivation to, despite not finding something, to keep looking further. I mean, Yiddish has been transliterated into English in various different ways. I mean, you standardize it in English in a certain way, like Latin text in a certain way, to like so to find a publication. You might have to change the way you spell something in Google or search result or like an archive. It really differs. I mean, this takes me back to something a separate project. I was trying to find poetry from a Holocaust survivor, and her name was, I found out, transliterated into Polish, which I don't know Polish, so I don't know how to transliterate into Polish, so I was very confused. I was transliterating her name into English, how I usually like to think. But, I think, I don't know if she's asking this like in a very, general thought or like literally where I found them, but I mean, it's a really, I don't know, like you don't find these in Penn's library because they just don't exist here. I mean, you would think Penn would have these materials. I mean, they have some, and they have like, I would say a full stack in Van Pelt here of Yiddish works, but I mean, besides that, there isn't too much. I mean, these things are also falling apart. I mean, we think about material and physicality of texts and sources, and I think, these things are crippling, and there's not too many people preserving them. I mean, libraries can be the stewards of their, continuous survival, but I mean, so many books have been lost in the history of Yiddish, and, I think right about now it's just the things that you can find, the things you can't. So it's very strange. I mean, some histories are just ultimately lost. Like, we don't have the pleasure of having ancestry for Yiddish people, considering the H word that happened. But I mean, documents are also burned, destroyed. So it's hard, but you just have to deal with it. And you can only be tenacious to a certain extent. Up to that point, I think it's not about giving up. It's about being realistic. Things are not there.
The gall to keep looking sounds like a perfect motto for humanities research to me, and maybe a good place to end. So let's thank our speakers for these wonderful papers again.